You all here today. This is rather exciting for us. We have not done this in over a year and a half, so feels kind of strange. I can tell you that I really appreciate all the work that Joe and Cecil and the whole team put into sort of getting this organized. Many of you maybe appreciate this with COVID. It's like you just forget how to do a lot of things. And in the meantime, a vendor goes out of business, so we have to find a new caterer, and you have to figure out a new way to sort of like do a lot of different things. So this has been kind of a big lift for our team to sort of like pull today's event off, just because it's been so long. So big thank you to Joe and Cecil and the whole team for really putting in a great effort on this. And then we've added the further embellishment of we're doing this hybrid. So we have about an equal number, if not more, people at home watching this or will watch this yet today. So. It's great to have you all here, and it's great to sort of like be with environmental professionals, students, and enthusiasts. My name is Jeff Sharp. If I didn't introduce myself, I'm Director of the School of Environment and Natural Resources. The Environmental Professionals Network, actually, we're entering our 10th year. So our first gathering of this sort was in August 7th, 2012. So this is our 10th year of actually doing this. We've done 70-some programs. Has anybody been with us for all 70 programs? I would suspect there are a few of you here that have been at quite a few of these, and so hopefully you've really grown over the years with this, and we're excited to sort of actually bring it to you again live today. I hope you've had a chance to talk and connect with one another here in the room. I did, and I'm reminded of how much I miss these interactions. It's great to sort of like cross paths with some of you that I haven't seen in face-to-face in over a year and a half. It'll take time to rebuild for our own safety, comfort, and confidence in these interactions, but I think we all know adhering to our best practices right now are important. We at OSU have started up, and we've had a great go so far, but we do have COVID has circulated on campus, and we've actually even had a couple faculty that have come down with it. So we are sensitive to sort of having to be safety conscious. So please adhere to the guidance that Joe provided. For today's program, Dr. Elena Irwin will draw parallels between our natural and human communities and how they respond, adapt, and are transformed by overwhelming events such as fire or other major crises. We'll also learn from two expert burn bosses and ecosystem managers on how we can intentionally enhance the future resiliency of natural communities through fire. The transformational heat crisis provided by fire for many ecosystems can bring out the inherent resiliency of native species. I can sort of say that one thing that COVID has done to us is sort of like challenge us in our resiliency in general as a community. And I hope that one takeaway in addition to the great program we have here today is one of our thoughts behind the EPN is to sort of create connections amongst people. And I do think as an environmental community, we are going to be strong for having these connections. And our hope is over the last 10 years that we've actually made some connections and we're more resilient. And I'm sure when we listen to Elena's remarks, we will learn more about the importance of these various forms of social connectedness toward resiliency. Before I transition to the program, I do want to give you a little update on the school. For those of you that are online or here that are not part of the OSU community, we are excited. The school is as big as it's ever been. We have over 1,000 students with us this year. We've been in existence for 53 years, and this is probably our largest cohort of students since the right when the school was created in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a big influx of a lot of students, and so we're probably in excess of what we were in those couple of years at the very foundation. We have currently about 130 graduate students and nearly 900 undergrads, adding up to over 1,000 students this year. If you're a student, can you raise your hand? And we're delighted to have so many students here at our very first EPN. I know this is early in the morning for you, and we appreciate you turning out. I suspect that we have a lot more of our environmental professionals at home, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to make all the connections we'd love to be able to make for you, but welcome if this is your first EPN. We hope to see you again here in the future. All students sign up at no cost for our EPN breakfast each month, thanks to the sponsorship from a variety of sponsors, including our school and the Sustainability Institute at Ohio State, as well as individuals who choose to sponsor a student through their registration process. Please read about those individuals in your program brochure. This brochure also features today's agenda and bios for each of our presenters. For those joining via EPN YouTube channel, now there is a link to your program brochure in the chat. Please feel free to utilize that chat function to post your comments, thoughts, and questions throughout the program. Our team will be reviewing these questions. We'll also take questions from the in-person audience here a little after 9 a.m. this morning. To provide our first presentation and to share some powerful thoughts on resiliency, transformation, and adaptation in our human communities through the wildfires of our global pandemic, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Elena Irwin, Distinguished Professor in Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences, and Faculty Director of the Sustainability Institute, Ohio State. Dr. Irwin was recently appointed to the U.S. EPA Science Advisory Board with a dual appointment on the Agricultural Sciences Committee. Congratulations, Elena, and thank you for representing Buckeye Country in D.C. We are so excited to hear from Elena today, and please come forward and take the podium.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for the introduction, and thank you, Joe, Cecil, and team for organizing the event and the opportunity to be here today. When Joe and I were talking about the topic today, resilient through fire, and also recognizing the fact that this is the first in-person back to quote-unquote some semblance of normalcy since in the last 18 months, it was impossible for us not to draw this analogy between fire and the pandemic as a catastrophic wildfire that has ravaged our communities individually and socially. And as we talked about that, we realized that there was this analogy to be drawn. And so it's my job today to share this broad perspective with you, thinking about our own resiliency as individuals, in community, in our state, our region, our country, and the world, our resiliency to this catastrophic shock of COVID. And really, it's ongoing crisis. It's not just one shock. It is an ongoing series of shocks, and how we might frame these experiences in the context of socioecological systems, theories of resilience, and human adaptation. The corona global pandemic has whipped through our communities and ravaged these communities across the globe, here locally, and across the globe at breakneck paces, hitting over 215 countries and regions worldwide with clearly catastrophic consequences. It's been a tsunami with multiple waves that we've never seen before, globally as well as in the US, and just when we think the virus is beaten, a new variant comes raging back. We all know these graphs, and so I won't spend any more time on it. What I do want to look at is how we have been hit and adapted and recovered from this initial shock. If you take a look at these two graphs, this is kind of the timeline of some of the basic components of the economy. On the top you see total consumer spending, on the bottom you see employment. And we can see this huge dip. So the yellow line here represents the rate of consumer spending and employment in the pre-pandemic time, January of 2020. And we see the big dip that occurred in middle part of March through April, both in terms of consumer spending and employment. Consumer spending plunged about 30% relative to what it was just a few weeks after the pandemic hit in mid-March. And much of this actually came from higher income people curtailing their spending, mostly related to in-person interactions. And as consumers curtailed that spending, businesses, of course, lost revenue and laid off employees. And this particularly hit low-wage employees particularly hard because a lot of those businesses that were laying people off were small businesses where that in-person interaction is critical, and all of a sudden went away with the hit of the pandemic. And so we struggled throughout that spring and summer, but following the nationwide lockdown, which was in March and April, some of the states started reopening non-essential businesses April, May, and once summer and fall came, we started to adjust to the pandemic life. Zoom meetings with pajama bottoms and fancy shirts on tops became the norm. Amazon deliveries skyrocketed. And the economy, as you can see here, recovered in time. And in fact, consumer spending reached its pre-pandemic levels as of this March. Employment still lagged behind, but as of end of June, it was back to overall to its pre-pandemic state. All of this despite the fact that the virus is still raging, and many of us are still working predominantly from home, and we are far from having returned to our normal sets of activities. But overall, based on this bird's eye view of the economy, we might think that we've adapted quite well. And there are parts of the economy that certainly have. But of course, it's not that simple. One of the key points is that the pandemic has really laid bare pre-existing conditions and pre-existing inequality conditions in our economy and in our society, and in fact is exacerbating them. Here you see the top graph in terms of employment rates. The red is high-wage workers, 60K or more. The bottom line is low-wage workers, 27K or less in terms of annual income. And while we might say that the recessionary times are over for high-income workers, clearly low-wage workers, it's a different story, and there's still 20% greater unemployment relative to pre-pandemic time for these workers. The bottom graph shows another similar type of story in terms of schooling outcomes. For students from high-income households, the red, there was some dips along the way, but recovered very quickly. This is in terms of online progress in terms of math coursework. But students from low-income households is a very different story, and they took a big hit, down 40% right after the pandemic hit, and are still, a year and a half later, struggling to get back to pre-pandemic progress metrics. And so the really critical point here is that these hits in our economy that are occurring, particularly to low-income groups, compound, right? As students lose progress and as workers lose wages, these things compound over time, and they get multiplied. And so workers and students fall further and further behind than where they would have been otherwise. And so all of this begs the question, when we talk about resilience, we have to talk about it in specific terms. Resilience of what, to what, and for whom. And so this leads me to talk about some definitions of resilience. There are resilience scholars who study the resilience of systems, whether those systems are ecosystems, human systems, socio-ecological systems. I see one of our scholars sitting there in the back, Matt Hamilton, who's an assistant professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And there are other people here at Ohio State who study these systems. And as scholars, we know that we have to ask these questions and be more specific in terms of thinking about resilience of what, to what, and for whom. There's a couple different definitions of resilience that I would like to spend just a couple of minutes on. One is this idea of bouncing back, and that is very much the idea that I was showing before with the graphs of employment and consumer spending. The idea being that we think of this over time. There's a shock, the system is negatively impacted, the system recovers and adapts over time after it absorbs that shock. And more resilient systems are able to better absorb the shock, they're better able to recover more quickly, and they adapt in the longer run. And so this idea of resilience is measured really in terms of time. How much time does it take us to recover? This is a very common way in which people are thinking about the impacts of the pandemic right now. The Economist, the magazine, actually has an index that they just published recently called the Normalcy Index, which is exactly that. It's what is our rate of normal behaviors in terms of economic and social activities now relative to what it was in pre-pandemic times. So apparently we're at 73% right now relative to 100% in pre-pandemic times based on the things that they're tracking. There's a different definition and a way of thinking about resilience, though, that might be a little bit more appropriate for where we are now and the kinds of systems that we're dealing with, which really are complex systems. This really comes from ecology and has been brought into this idea of socio-ecological systems or human natural systems and their interactions. And it's really a much more dynamic and evolutionary way of thinking about how a shock might affect a system. Rather than thinking about bouncing back and going back to that pre-pandemic or pre-shock state, the idea here is that we adapt and we change, and we, in fact, transform our systems. One of the features of these kinds of systems are tipping points or thresholds. That once we reach a tipping point or a threshold, the system doesn't return to where it was before because it can't. The dynamics don't allow it. It's pretty easy to think about tipping points in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Think about before the pandemic, for example, employers would have never allowed employees to stay home full-time, 5 days a week, working from home. And now it's common and normal and accepted, and we're unlikely to go back to that pre-pandemic state where we were all working in offices 5 days a week. So let's consider an example, and I'm going to put this in terms of community well-being because we're talking about socio-ecological systems. So on the vertical axis here, you see some index of community well-being. You could think of this as an amalgamation of economic, social, environmental indicators that are all aggregated and indexed to create an index of well-being. Quality of life metrics kind of get at this. And then on the horizontal axis, we see a measure, a key component that would influence community well-being, and we could choose any number of components. Here I'm going to choose a variable that we'll just refer to as access to services, or as you go from the left to the right, it's actually lack of access to services. So you could think of services broadly, or you could think specifically about educational services, so access to schooling, or you could think about health services, access to hospitals and specialized medical treatment. And so naturally, we would expect this relationship to be downward sloping, right? That high levels of well-being will be associated with high levels of access to services, and low levels of well-being would be associated with a lack of access to services. So I'm going to draw some dots on the screen. So a green dot represents a point in time, right? A state of the community at a point in time. The green dot that you see here is in the upper left corner, and so it's a high well-being, associated with a high well-being and high access to services. And we could think of a number of green dots being in this upper left quadrant. We could probably even draw a line of sorts. So the blue line represents a series of states that are all associated with this high well-being condition. And the important thing here is that it also represents stable states. So these are states that if we have a shock and we kind of get knocked off of this blue line, we're going to go back to the blue line because the blue line is a stable state. It's the system, or you might think about it as the system in equilibrium. And that's because when we have high levels of access to services, we tend to come back to high levels of well-being. And so the COVID-19 shock might be a really big shock, and it might knock us off of that equilibrium, that blue line. But the point here is the dynamics of the system are such that as long as we continue to have sufficient access to services, we'll recover, and we'll come back up to this blue line, this stable branch or set of equilibrium. And over time, we may even adapt and recover and get back to our pre-shock state. So that's kind of the bouncing back story, right? That's the story that we told before. But you could also imagine the opposite, right? So a cluster of outcomes that are in this lower right quadrant that are associated with low levels of well-being and high levels of lack of access to services. And that if we're along this red line, there might be certain interventions that local government or state government might try to help spur a community towards better well-being. For example, in our current environment, we might try to offer a lot of services to people living in these communities to try to make them better off. And so we might expand services, hoping that we're going to get back up to some level of high well-being. But the dynamics of this system are such that we just go up to the red line because the red line represents the set of stable points. And so this is kind of a story in which a community might get stuck. Because it starts with a low level of access to services. We might expand those access to services, but there might be other underlying conditions that cause that community to not be able to recover in a way that we might think it should. And so this is also a feature of these kinds of complex systems, this idea that we might get to a low-lying equilibrium in which there's few resources and then get stuck there. And it might be very hard to get unstuck and to get out of that, what we would call an undesirable state. When we bring these two lines together, we can start to really describe the dynamics of the system. And it really emphasizes a key point here. And that is that in some regions of access to services, there's two possible states. There's multiple stable states that are possible. And this is also another common aspect of these kinds of systems. It's called state dependence. it matters where you start. The pre-existing condition matters for where you end up. So taking, for example, the blue line, if we started at the upper left at a very desirable state, and we gradually lost services, we would travel along that blue line and we would get to the upper green dot perhaps. But if we started with a severe lack of services and tried to add services, we would go to the left and get maybe to that lower green dot. We'd have the exact same access to services, but be in very different states. And so that's another common element of these kinds of complex systems, is that there are multiple stable states, and depending on where you start, that depends on what's possible and where you end up. Now, what happens if there's a shock? The question here is, will you return? Let's say you're at the blue line. Will you return to the blue line? Or might you fall suddenly or unexpectedly to a low-lying equilibrium represented by the red line? And so where these lines are overlapping is kind of a zone of danger or a zone of instability. You see the dotted line there that's connecting the two lines that represents that. And this dotted line is kind of a dividing line of sorts. It represents that if the system gets to that dotted line, it's really a tipping point because it's not stable. And so we will travel away from the dotted line. And so if you think about a system that loses, let's say we start on the blue line, we're at a high level of well-being, but we're losing resilience because there are shocks to the system that are causing services to become degraded, overwhelmed perhaps, if you put it in the COVID example, hospitals are becoming crowded, access to services is diminishing. We might move to the right and become less resilient as we do. And as we enter that yellow zone, any shock that pushes the community off of this stable line, it just takes a smaller and smaller shock in order to push us to this point of instability. And when we reach that point of instability, that's when the tipping point occurs, and we could see a sudden transformation or crash or flip of the system to the low-lying equilibrium. And it's common. I mean, we could easily think of communities that are in this situation. For example, through a shock like COVID, or through dealing with natural disasters in terms of flooding or hurricanes or other kinds of events, that we gradually lose access to resources, access to services, and become less and less resilient until we get to a point where just even a small shock might push this community over a tipping point and into a low-lying equilibrium that's then becomes very hard to recover from. And so this is another key characteristics of these systems, is that there's an irreversibility, that once you go to this low-lying equilibrium, it's really hard to get back. You can't just reverse things, or things are at least only slowly reversible. So clearly, all of this is, I think, very apropos for the conditions in which we're in now. The other thing that's really important to note here, though, and the happy kind of note of all of this, is that this isn't set in stone, right? Humans have their own reactions and ability to adapt, and so adaptations in this diagram push us to the left. And we can think of many different kinds of adaptations that we've had in our COVID times. The vaccination and the development of the vaccines, the deployment and distribution of those have been a tremendous example of how we have adapted successfully to this COVID state. And that pushes us to the left. It has made many communities much more resilient and really is a huge factor for why we see that recovery of the economy as much as we have. Another interesting adaptation, there's many that we could talk about, but one that I think is also interesting is how we have decided to change in terms of spending our time. On average, people have a little bit more leisure time. Now, that's not true of everybody, but on average, that has been true, about 15% more. And there's been, in part, a massive resurgence of spending time outdoors, more time in nature. According to data from Google Maps, visitation to parks were up 50% in the summer of 2020 relative to pre-pandemic times. And again, this past summer, about the same. So there's all kinds of adaptations that will also lead to greater well-being. And so the key here is that we don't always return, and because of the dynamics of this system and because of the adaptations, just bouncing back to where we were before is not what will happen with these complex systems, and it's certainly not what we can expect to happen with where we are now. Now, this is a very simplistic diagram in many different ways, but I think it does help to illustrate some of the really key aspects of the complex systems thinking that is really applicable to this time of where we are now. And that is under what conditions might we bounce back? Under what conditions might we get stuck? Under what conditions might we expect to see rapid change? It really depends on the state that we started in. So in reality, there are many, many different factors that will allow a community to build resilience. And so resiliency scholars ask this question of what enables communities to adapt to disasters, whether they be health, environmental, economic, or social. And a common framework in which scholars think about this is a community capitals framework. Of course, answering that question is very, very difficult and challenging, but if we think at a high level, it's this idea of community capitals that can be a useful one. If we think about what builds resilience and what builds well-being in a community, it's really not just financial capital, although of course that is important. It's all the other forms of capital that we have, including natural capital, the forests, the wetlands, the other natural ecosystems that we have in our communities, built capital in terms of our infrastructure, human capital in terms of the stock of knowledge and education that we have, social capital, which is our relationships that we have with each other, and of course, health capital. And the interesting thing, and a topic of a lot of study, is that these capitals interact in complex ways, but they can be very synergistic. So for example, there's evidence to show that high forms of social capital, the relationships and interactions that we have with other high quality interactions, lead to better health outcomes. And so those are the really interesting and important relationships that we can take advantage of. In closing, I just want to say and acknowledge that we are in a period of extreme uncertainty right now. And we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We're still in the midst of all of this. We're seeing many signs of recovery, and we see some things emerging that point to a post-COVID life. But we don't know. We don't know where we're going to go. But I would say two things are for certain. The first is we aren't just bouncing back. Right? We are clearly adapting and transforming our systems in many ways that are good, in some ways that may not be so good. And this is the second point, is that those pre-existing conditions that were there before COVID even hit, those inequalities that have worsened and are becoming hardened, those need to be addressed, because communities that are inequitable are communities that are also less resilient. And so if we want to make ourselves resilient to future shocks, pandemics, threats from global climate change, whatever they may be, addressing these inequalities now is critical. Thank you very much, and I am turning it over to Roger Williams for the next presentation.
Well, when Joe had first contacted me about making this presentation this morning, he was talking about, relating fire with COVID. And my first thought was, he must be out of his mind. But as I thought more about it and, what Elena had presented, there's really a lot of parallel with when we talk about resiliency through fire and what we're seeing in our resiliency as a society in coming back from this pandemic, okay? I want to talk a little bit then this morning about this resiliency, how fire is used in ecosystems to bring them back, to help them recover from a variety of different, you might say, infections that they have had that has caused changes, okay? First, I want to talk a little bit about fire's role in systems. Now, fire is a disturbance process in all ecosystems. Fire occurs in some ecosystems more than others. Fire will occur at higher intensities in some ecosystems more than others. Fire occurs during certain times of the year in specific ecosystems and different from others. And ecosystems, and all what I am talking about right now is what we refer to as a variety of different fire regimes that all these different ecosystems have developed with as part of their processes, okay? And so a lot of the different fire regimes have helped to determine and define what all of these different ecosystems are. They have grown up with fire, okay? So while all ecosystems can benefit from fire and experience fire through different degrees, what we find is actually there are some ecosystems that are very dependent upon fire. Their existence would not be out there, okay? We have some ecosystems, I've listed a few here: aspen, giant sequoia, jack pine, lodgepole pine, longleaf pine, oak hickory, of course we have here in Ohio, ponderosa pine, pitch pine, prairies and grasslands, redwood, shortleaf pine, so forth, etc. There are a variety of ecosystems. Some of these ecosystems require fire just to maintain their presence on the landscape, while other ecosystems require fire as part of their regenerative process, okay? So, as I mentioned, a lot of ecosystems do benefit from fire. Well, what are those benefits, right? Some species require it for regeneration. Some species require it to assist it in maintaining a dominant presence on the landscape. It prepares good seed beds by reducing ecosystem litter. It helps to recycle nutrients. It reduces, or even in some cases eliminates harmful insect and disease populations. Fire can be thought of somewhat as a cleansing agent in some of these ecosystems. It certainly helps to maintain healthier forest densities. It helps to open the canopy to improve regeneration and growth underneath. It also is important in that it improves, or it maintains, or in some cases creates wildlife habitat. You know, one of the things I'll talk about just a minute is the destructive nature of fires. And certainly that's one of the things that we often hear most about. And certainly fire has a destructive component to it. But also realize that in certain ecosystems, while it might destroy one ecosystem, it will create another unique one that will take its place. It helps to reduce fuel loads out there so that we don't have many of these catastrophic fires that exist in the systems. So what happens then in these, talking about these different fire regimes, what happens then when these ecosystems miss their return fire intervals? Well, it starts a cascade of a lot of different events. Forest densities certainly increase to higher levels. Now, what happens here? Well, overcrowding results, right? Causing higher mortality rates, reductions in health and vigor of individual trees. Forest canopies become denser, creating greater difficulty in the regeneration of that forest. Trees and shrub species that are more tolerant of shade develop in the understories, which tends to exacerbate the situation in some ecosystems. And this creates a higher than normal fuel load buildup. So the increase in forest density results in abnormal fire behavior. The buildup of the fuel load provides greater potential for more available fuel for a fire when it occurs. More available fuel often equates with higher fire intensities. It's more likely that fire ladders, when we talk about fire ladders, this is when you start getting development of different understory strata in the forest. And so when many fires do occur as surface fires, but surface fires will work their way up through the understory and will then become crown fires, stand replacing fires as a result. In many ecosystems, this is an abnormal event. Okay? So these abnormal fire behavior events that we see often results in different outcomes that would have occurred under what would have been normal situations. So, if several fire intervals have been missed and fire has yet to return, then it changes in ecosystem species composition and structure will occur. Fire intolerant species are allowed to fully develop in those ecosystems, okay? And often to the demise of the fire tolerant species. Ecosystems with time will typically convert to species that are fire intolerant and often are more aggressive in their competition compared to fire-tolerant species. Fire-dependent species ecosystems therefore typically decline over time as a result of not having fire to help regenerate that system or help maintain that particular system that has developed within a particular fire regime. You know, when we often think about these different ecosystems developing naturally through time, many of these ecosystems, part of that natural development has also been the occurrence of fire at certain intervals that have occurred while that ecosystem has developed. That's a part of that ecosystem. So, in the absence of fire, you've removed a very important ecosystem development mechanism. Then the trajectory of that ecosystem starts taking a different path over time. Okay? And in the case of prairies, what we see is that over time, prairies can and will develop into forests. All right? So what we have seen is this shift in paradigms. For a long time, we viewed fire as an enemy of the forest, okay? And primarily because of its destructive nature. There's no doubt fire is a destructive force. But, and certainly when we start looking at the increase in the occurrence of the wildland-urban interface, that destructive nature becomes more prevalent, right? That's what we hear a lot about in the news. It's destructive power. There's no denying that. So in that paradigm, then we tried to keep fire out of all ecosystems because of its destruction. That's all that we viewed fire as, a destructive force, and it is. But we began to realize, because we saw changes in our ecosystems, we saw disappearance of ecosystems. The longleaf pine forest along the Gulf Coast, one of the reasons for its massive disappearance was the fact of the lack of fire. Now, there's some other things that exacerbated that situation, such as the more commercialization of loblolly pine species, but nevertheless, fire was one of the critical components of that ecosystem. Regenerative. Longleaf really needs fire to regenerate it. So we began to see then that, well, maybe fire is actually can be a friend of the forest. And that's what we have certainly witnessed in the changes of our paradigms. Now, following the medical theme, I suppose, I guess I would like to think that ecosystem managers are actually, can be thought of as ecosystem doctors. We determine if an ecosystem suffers an illness. There's something different, there's something wrong. We determine what that illness is. We decide then what treatments are necessary to restore that ecosystem's health. We thereby develop a prescription for that ecosystem. And the prescription actually may or may not include fire, but nevertheless, we analyze it, we try to determine what that illness is. Now, if fire is part of the treatment plan to restore the health of that ecosystem, then what kind of fire and how often? What's the dosage that we need to employ to try to bring that ecosystem back to health? So let me go through a couple examples. So let's say we have oak forest ecosystems. And the diagnosis is that there certainly is an ample supply of acorns for regeneration purposes. Seedlings are germinating. We see that. Seedlings, however, are suffering premature mortality due to competition, and they're not making it to the mid-story levels. And we have also in there an unnaturally high number of oak competitors. Okay? That's our diagnosis. Well, as with all illnesses, what's the cause? We have to determine the cause. Well, let's say then that we have determined that one of the primary causes of this illness has been the fact that this ecosystem has missed several fire return intervals. Well, the prescription then might be administer fire every 3 to 4 years to reduce the competition. And then when the competition has been brought back to normal levels, reduce the dosage to 10 to 15 years. Okay? Now, again, not all ecosystems are the same. This would be a particular prescription of treatments that you might have for a particular ecosystem based upon what those conditions are. So, for example, you might take, here's the X-ray of the ecosystem. This actually is of Richland Furnace State Forest. Dan, Greg. You know, when you look at what's going on, right, you have to analyze it, the treatment. What we see is what? Well, we see certainly it is an oak-dominated overstory. It's an oak forest. We look down on the forest floor and we see oak is regenerating. Okay, there's no problem there, but the problem is that if we look at mid-story levels, there is no oak present. Okay? Something is going on here. We got plenty of a seed source. We are getting regeneration, but they are dying prematurely. They are not reaching mid-story levels. Okay? So, we have to examine what is the illness and prescribe the treatment for it. If you look at maybe some of the tall grass prairie ecosystems, when you're looking what might be a problem, right? Looking at its health. The diagnosis might be the prairie is being overtaken by non-native grasses and forbs. tends to be choking out native grasses. We're starting to see woody shrubs and trees beginning to invade the prairie system. And the prognosis is that this prairie will slowly become a forest over time. Basically, the prognosis is death of this prairie. So, again, we look at what's causing this illness. And again, we might determine that it's missed several return fire intervals in keeping that prairie system healthy. Well, the prescription might be administer fire every 3 years to reduce non-natives and eliminate woody species, maybe seed in native grasses, maybe some additional mechanical treatments may be necessary if non-native densities are too high. You know, one of the problems we have with non-native species, they respond to fire too. And some of our non-native species actually are fire adapted. So that sort of exacerbates that particular problem. We may have to actually use some additional mechanical treatments to help eliminate that infection. Okay? So growing season burns may be used if the woody stem density is high or less responsive to burns at other times of the year. You know, woody plants are more susceptible to fire during the growing season because of the highly active cambium that we see in these woody stems. But anybody who has dealt with fire, with prescribed burning, you know, and burning in the growing season is much more difficult because that's when your fuel out there is very moist. It becomes very difficult to burn. Your fuel has to be dehydrated before it will burn. Okay? And then eventually maybe reduce the dosage to every 5 years once the prairie illness has been controlled. Okay? An ongoing treatment. Now, I'll just show you a short video here of some of the administration of some of these different treatments. Why did it stop? Sorry, wants to stop on its own here. Okay, so just some closing thoughts about resiliency to fire, through fire. Really what we find through all of our practices, our research, and working with fire and ecosystems, we do find that many ecosystems are very resilient with fire. They respond. Okay, the prescription that we provide these ecosystems, it may be additional things, including fire, but they will respond. While fire may be a needed prescription for many ecosystems, I should emphasize it's not to be necessarily administered to all ecosystems. Again, the ecosystem doctor has to thoroughly diagnose what the problems are in that ecosystem. What are the illnesses, if any? Just like any medicine, it can't be given at the same dosage for all ecosystems. All fires are not the same. All ecosystems are not the same. The dosage of fire will not be the same for all ecosystems. It will depend upon the state of the illness and what the appropriate prescriptions will need to be. Whether or not fire, which is medicine, keeping that same theme, is to be prescribed will depend upon the ecosystem, the patient, and the amount of departure from the natural conditions. Basically, what is the illness? Okay? All right. I guess I turn over to Jack somewhere here. You'll see him on the screen shortly, I'm sure.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just making sure I'm actually on and you can hear me. And I have my video on, so hopefully you can see me too. I'm waiting for confirmation. Okay, looks like we're good to go. All right, so when I was asked to help with this, I had a similar thoughts like, wow, is this a reach? And I thought, well, it actually isn't a reach. Fire is an abiotic disturbance. The pandemic is a biotic disturbance. And so overcoming those types of disturbances or learning to adapt to them is what brings the resiliency. So we're going to talk about, now Roger talked about the ecology and the wildland fire science, and what we're going to talk about is how do we take that science, whether it's existing science or new science, and kind of share that out, collaborate, get that into the hands of managers. And so that we're going to talk about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and other groups. And my screen is froze, of course. There we go. So before we dive any further, though, just want to give a quick background, because if you're looking saying, who is this guy who's talking about fire? Does he know what he's talking about? Hopefully I do. I have bachelor's and master's from universities in the Lake States region or in the Midwest. But none of those, during my career there was no fire courses. So I'm happy to see that there's more fire courses taking place. And the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, we've been helping stand up some of those courses at universities where there are not courses. The work history, my work history is where a lot of the learning came in with fire. So quite a bit of seasonal work, quite a bit with the Nature Conservancy, that's where the majority was. Some as a consultant contractor, and I'm the program manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. I worked wildfire and a lot of prescribed fire throughout US, and I am still an instructor for quite a few different fire classes and courses. But what is the Fire Science Exchange Network. And I'll explain that first, and then we'll talk about the Joint Fire Science Program. Fire Science Exchange Network, there's 15 fire science exchanges or consortia across the U.S. You can see them here. There's 10 years now of knowledge exchange that's been happening. Focus a little bit in on the lake states. These are artificial boundaries. The Lake States Consortium may look a little small, but remember, we go way up into Canada too. So it's just happening to show the US map. You might be wondering, I'm talking from the Arrowhead of Minnesota, and you're asking, what does this have to do with fire in Ohio? Well, it's all part of the Lake States ecosystem in general, and the Lake States Fire Science Consortium is one of the sponsored projects that's run through the Ohio State University. Dr. Eric Toman is our program director. He's sitting somewhere in the audience, I believe. So that's our connection. With the consortium, we have other principal investigators at other universities, plus also with the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. And then we have an advisory board made up of quite a few different land managers and fire managers from different federal, state, and non-governmental agencies to help kind of guide our sharing of fire science. So what is the Joint Fire Science Program? It's you can see right there, it's a collaboration of pooling of funding from the USDA and USDI, and it was set up to fund new fire science research and studies. But it quickly became clear that as good as the science was, if the science from the researchers did not get into the hands of the managers, it was kind of useless. So part of the Joint Fire Science Program was to stand up these fire science exchange networks, the consortia and the exchanges, to kind of build that bridge and get the science from the research into the hands of the managers, to get what the managers know and have learned the hard way on the ground into the hands of the researchers, and vice versa. So build that communication. And I like to break it down. How we share this out, there's two main ways. We do it through passive communications and active communications. Some examples of the passive communications, all the exchanges have websites. We do research briefs and webinars and so on. But again, that's a one-way communication often. Our active communications is where we can really kind of dig in and build that collaboration. We can do that through different fire trainings, panel series, workshops, field trips. I'm going to give a variety of examples of this. So for the lake states, I'll show two quick passive communication resource examples that really did not need to change during the pandemic because they are resilient as is. One of them is our citation database. This is a searchable database of all the different fire science publications in the lake states. And you can go in and search and see what there is, or if there are gaps in them. We've obviously discovered quite a few gaps in fire science information. So I encourage you to use that. Professors, students, you name it, and give us feedback too. And that's updated twice a year with any new fire science research. We also do research briefs, and essentially what these research briefs are, they're quick 1 to 2 page briefs. They're usually of peer-reviewed journal articles or other information, and it condenses it down into a quick read. And we have briefs on climate and invasive species, other literature, natural communities, wildlife, so on. But let's get into the active communication or examples of that. And so what is involved in active communication and exchange of the fire science information? And I put this up because I do believe that many cartoonists are some of the greatest communicators, because with a few pen strokes, they try to get across an idea and share it. And I think this one's pretty good with Calvin and Hobbes, because it kind of highlights why we are trying to share information back and forth, because Calvin's perception of a fire is different from his dad's perception of that fire. So we need to overcome these kind of misunderstandings of fire so that we can kind of further that fire science. So some of our application examples, here's some workshops. We do regular workshops that are located in states. in order to kind of minimize travel restrictions by a lot of our members. So we have the burning issues workshop in Michigan, a fire in Minnesota workshop, one in Wisconsin. There is one that will be in Ohio. That's by my counterpart with the Tallgrass Prairie Fire Science Consortium. We also have developed a variety of specialty workshops. So fire and fuels monitoring workshop, a smoke tools workshop, and those are hands-on workshops, smaller participants. And the fire and fuels workshop, for instance, we had a need to do that fire and fuels monitoring workshop, but because of the pandemic, we were kind of stymied short for a little bit because typically that's a hands-on. But we were creative. We adapted that to a virtual world and did it as a hybrid. So there was one day with satellite locations that people could go to do hands-on. Everything else we did through Zoom. And it worked very well. It was an example of how to kind of adapt these successful workshops that were needed into kind of that virtual or hybrid world. We took it a step further because, again, with the pandemic, and typically most of the consortium are most successful types of hands-on or sharing are the field trips and workshops, so on. We decided to take this a step, and we developed what we call Fuel and Collaboration Panel Discussion Series, and it's aptly named. It's Fuel and Collaboration. But this is all in the virtual world, but it's not a webinar. We gather 4 or 5 subject matter experts, and we gather questions from people who register or want to participate in this. And then we have a panel discussion. So we try to make it as interactive as possible. And these have been extremely successful. We did our first season as a trial, and we did that with a number of other fire science exchanges and with the Northern Research Station, the Forest Service. And you can see, here's the example we put forward. Using fire history to inform our present day management, using fire seasonality to open the burn window. What does the changing climate mean for fire? And then looking at timber management prescribed fire, and this was focused more on oak systems. These are all recorded, and the questions are also available. You can now go to the new website that we set up. It's a standalone website. It's fuelingcollab.com, or you can Google Fuel and Collaboration panel series, and it'll bring you right to it. And because it was so successful, we decided, man, we're going to keep doing this, even if and when we're out of COVID. So the series that's coming up right here, Prescribed Fire and Species of Conservation Concern, Fire and Carbon Cycle, Fire and Timber Management, Smoke is Not Just Smoke, the Urban Interface in Fire, and Thinking Beyond Fuel Reduction. So you can get on that website and register for any of these, submit questions, so on, find out the dates, get those dates locked in. And I'll wrap up here with the next couple slides, and Roger referenced it about burning in the growing season. So one of our kind of ongoing projects, and we've had it in events, workshops, so on, but it has to do with opening the burn window and thinking about seasonality of fire and burning in the growing season. And this is what I faced when I was doing prescribed burns even 25, 30 years ago. People would say you cannot burn in the summer. It won't burn in the summer. Well, this is a picture of a burn in the summer, and you certainly can. So what we've been working at is trying to help people overcome their impediment of only burning during what's called the traditional season, so spring or fall. When in reality, most of our natural communities can and do burn during the growing season. And I have tens of thousands of pictures and many thousands of burns to back up that statement. And just to wrap it up again, and Roger referenced this, but we get different seasonal fire effects of native plants, for instance. That's what I'm showing. So if we only burn in April or May or October or November in the northern states, we're favoring a subset of certain plants. If we open that up, we're breaking up that dominance, actually increasing diversity and increasing resiliency of that whole system. And this there's a lot packed in this one slide, but it also indicates that with the changing of seasons, changing of climate, and so on, that it's just not one factor. Every fire is different depending on the phenology, the physiology, what's happening during that season. Are we in drought? for a wet year or so on. And so we've been working hard at different locations to help people get over their real or perceived growing season fire impediments. Some of it's the lack of knowledge or available information. There's not a lot of science information right now on seasonal fire effects. It really is in the hands of the managers. And the other is getting over the expectation. If people are used to doing dormant season burns, Roger referenced it, doing a growing season burn is much different. But there have been examples right in Ohio too, at Kitty Todd Preserve. The Toledo Metro Parks did their first growing season burn last year. So we're seeing this adaptation of us igniting fire in different seasons and learning the different effects from that. So I will wrap it up there and leave you with that, Calvin and Hobbes.
All right, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Roger and Elena. We now have we got plenty of time for questions, so you can ask questions to our speakers here in-house, Elena and Roger, or to even Jack, who's able to hear us over in Minnesota. So open it up to questions. And just feel free to raise your hand, and I'll bring you a microphone so we can hear it.
What are some other solutions over fire, if there are any? Because if there was an ecosystem with like an endangered animal or something, obviously a prescribed burn may not be the right decision. So I was just curious what other solutions could be applicable in an ecosystem.
You're going to have to repeat that because with a mask on, you're going to have to speak a little louder. At my age, I have some difficulties with hearing, so.
My question was, what are other solutions over fire that are applicable in an ecosystem if there was like an endangered animal or something in the area? What are other possible solutions?
So basically, you're asking, is there other things we can use instead of fire? Sure. There's many other things that we can use. And actually we've done some studies with this in the past of using mechanical treatments. We don't understand perfectly, but we do know, we have ideas about what the end results are of fire, what fire produces when it's completed. And we look at the changes in the structure of an ecosystem, what species may or may not get eliminated as a result of fire. One of the things you can do then is rather than using fire, go in there in mechanical treatments, saws, whatever, to remove any vegetation, to change it to the structure that you would have if it had been a fire. All right? Now, there are obviously some assumptions in doing that you are making an assumption that what you create mechanically is what fire would have produced. You will never really know that. But that's one of the things, because some ecosystems that really might need fire, we can't use fire because there's too much fuel in there. And so we have to go in and reduce the fuel loading in those cases so that you can really create a worse problem by putting a fire in a system that has a higher than normal fuel loading that's going to cause a fire to be more intense than normal. So other options have also been, which, from an environmental perspective, some people are not very happy with, but that's the use of herbicides to change that structure also.
Any other questions? Or Jack, do you want to try to field that question? And again, the question was regarding what to do in a habitat that might need a fire treatment, but is home to endangered wildlife or other species.
Yeah, Roger answered it very well, and my background with the Nature Conservancy was doing just that. How do we get fire back into systems when we're dealing with a rare endangered species? In almost every case, we're able to do it. It's just very careful initially starting. I'd like to push the advice, though, that often the rare endangered species that live in a fire dependent system are rare or endangered because of the lack of fire in those systems. You know, what we're dealing with often is we have a population that's, you know, at risk. And yes, if we put fire in at the wrong time or wrong way, we could take out too many individuals and actually lose that species. But if we don't get fire back in, eventually we're going to lose the whole population, potentially. I mean, there certainly are mitigations we can try to do, but in the long run, nothing quite does the same as fire. I mean, like I said, my examples come a lot from Michigan, Wisconsin, with the Nature Conservancy. And in every case working with endangered species, we were able to get fire back into that system, along with other types of treatments, mechanical, herbicide, you name it, to promote that system and the resiliency. And at the same time, increase the population of that one rare species.
Right. See, sometimes the species is endangered because the habitat that it requires is one that's produced by fire. You know, we see out in the western U.S., the intensively burned forests produce a unique habitat that is short-lived for a wide variety of species that really only thrive in intensely burned forests. So, as Jack was saying, sometimes those species are endangered because the habitat has been altered or in some cases has disappeared because of the lack of fire.
We have time for more questions. I'll ask one which came from an EPN participant a couple weeks ago, actually, in response to this program. And the question was about climate change. And if we think there's an increasing growth in invasive species in some of our ecosystems here in Ohio and the Great Lakes area, and we need fire to treat our ecosystems, is that actually increasing climate change, burning more carbon, et cetera? Is that actually further enhancing the global warming process by creating prescribed burns? Can you comment on those interactions?
Well, first of all, as I pointed out, fire is destructive, okay? And depending on a particular year, what the fire season is like, wildland fires can contribute to the national, global, or national carbon emissions anywhere from 3 to 10%, you know, because obviously one of the major byproducts of fire is carbon, right? Now, one of the things we have to understand is that fire is a natural part of ecosystems. Fire is a part of the natural carbon cycle. So we have actually, you know, if we look at historically over the last several decades, we've actually had much less carbon emissions as a result of fire because of our policies of preventing fire from occurring and so forth. That has certainly exacerbated the situation now. When fire occurs, it's occurring in ecosystems that have accumulated a lot more fuels and has accumulated thereby a lot more carbon stocks in those forests, okay? And so the fire is actually releasing the carbon as part of the natural process. Now, because the ecosystems are in such a state that there is a higher amount of carbon stocks in those forests, because of the lack of fire, We are now releasing all that carbon that has been stored additionally. But again, part of the carbon cycle, those same forests that regenerate after a fire will sequester carbon again. And the young forests are much better at sequestering carbon than old forests. They sequester carbon at higher rates than old forests. Now, old forests store more carbon, obviously. But so it's part of the natural carbon cycle. The other thing is that actually the use of prescribed fire, you are able to control a little bit more about the amount of carbon that's emitted. We did a study here in Southern Ohio. We did some modeling with it, and we compared what would happen if a wildfire went through a forest compared to doing a prescribed burn in the same forest. The wildfire emitted more carbon than the prescribed burn. What the prescribed burn does, the prescribed burn reduces the probability that a large wildfire will go through there and emit greater amounts of carbon. Jack, do you want to add anything to that?
But I think it's a good, no, excellent answer. And just also keep in mind, not just forests, but grasslands. I mean, any system can sequester carbon, and so often prairies are forgotten about that. And, we have minimal amount of prairies across the country, but they do a lot of great carbon storage. And then also think from the perspective, Roger mentioned that prescribed fire, and how it can release less carbon, but then because of the new growth, sequester more. Also keep in mind, thinking not from the aspect of carbon, but from the aspect of reducing the catastrophic nature of any wildfire. Because it's not a question of if there's going to be a wildfire, it's a question of when. And if you can get prescribed fire back into a system and kind of get that, as part of the system again, those wildfires will be less destructive because there's less fuel to burn. And there's great examples out of the South, but there's also a recent example right here out of Minnesota, the Greenwood fire, and where there was able to be containment, or at least assistance in containment and reduction in intensity, was where the Forest Service had done some prescribed burns. So it's trying to get people to change their attitude towards fire as bad, but fire is, you have to live with fire. And in this case, doing more prescribed fire is good for the ecology, but also is a way to reduce fuel so that the next wildfire, unplanned fire, is less catastrophic. And at the same time, we're adapting that carbon cycle again, as fire as a natural part of the system.
Okay, it looks like our battery's going to run out about the time our program is, so good timing there. Thank you, Roger, Jack, and Elena, for your remarks in today's presentations. I really appreciated this particular program. I've come to appreciate it in the school as well, that we actually have quite a bit of educational opportunities we have for fire. Roger didn't mention this, but he does teach a class that you can actually take here at Ohio State that you would allow you to become Red Card certified. And if you wanted to be sort of like involved in forest fire management, you would be eligible to sort of pursue that sort of career. So, and we also, Roger didn't mention this, and we have some other sort of projects in school, but he's got this amazing project, just got funded from NSF to look at using drones to sort of like monitor the movement of fire and sort of like how that works, work with some engineers. So that and Eric Toman and a few of the other team are doing some really, Matt Davies are doing some really great stuff in this space. So this is a little niche of the school, or at least Ohio State, that we have some expertise in that I think kind of goes hidden. You may recall our EPN tradition is to provide a framed certificate of participation to our in-person presenters and speakers. I do have those certificates up here, and I'll pass those out after we wrap up. And Jack, don't worry, we'll be sending you an electronic version later today. That concludes today's program. Please turn to the back of your brochure to see what our upcoming breakfast events are. On Tuesday, October 12th, Yolanda Owens, Chief Cultivator of Forage and Black, will moderate and facilitate an engaging dialogue on the role of Black farmers in shaping the future of agriculture in Ohio and beyond. This program will feature Black farmers and advocates who are growing and enhancing connections to the land through agriculture and other regenerative land and community practices, including for youth of color. In addition, we'll be joined by leaders from Ohio's 2 land-grant institutions, Central State and Ohio State University, who will share about their efforts through extension, engineering, and agricultural science to improve opportunities for Black farmers here in Ohio. Registration is open at epn.osu.edu, so be sure to sign up today. This program will be live streamed via EPN's YouTube channel as well. Last, while you are making your way out the door or clearing your tables, please pay close attention to the waste signs right over here to the left. The plates and utensils are compostable, not recyclable, so please place those in the waste. We're excited to bring you zero waste programming back. We're excited to have the zero waste programming events with you. Thank you for participation today. We are happy to have had so many people joining us from afar, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great day.